Hi everyone, it's Andrew Byrne here. Thanks very much for joining me. In this video, I've got something a little bit different for you. I'm joined by Michael Elderkin, the developer of Curvature, a new piece of software aimed to help bassoonists design and 3D print their own straight shapers. This is an exciting moment for anyone interested in reed design, and I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Michael to the channel. Oh, and one more thing. It's morphin' time.
Brontosaurus!
And don't forget, if you like this video and others on this channel, to hit the subscribe button and make sure that notifications are on so that you can find your way back to the next one. Michael Elderkin, thanks very much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew. It's a pleasure being with you.
What is Curvature and what inspired you to develop it?
So, Curvature is a program I designed that allows the individual user to create custom 3D printable shapes. And the reason why I decided to develop it is it sort of emerged from a personal problem I was having in that I was very dissatisfied with commercially available contrabassoon shapers. I was always finding that they were sort of slightly too wide, or maybe the throat in relation to the aperture at the tip was not the correct ratio for what I was going for sound wise. So I found myself continually sanding down the sides of reeds and trying to adjust the shapes, but that only works to a certain extent. It works for each individual reed, but you don't exactly have that consistency of shape between reeds. And so I thought, well, 3D printing technology has never been more accessible, both availability wise and cost wise. So why don't I try to create a 3D shaper? So I did that. I tried to design it in a CAD program by hand, which proved to be a little bit more difficult than I imagined, just because if you're doing straight line shapes, so connecting one point to another point, it's easy enough to do. But when you start to get into the spline shapes, where it's that smooth curve, it required a lot of manpower to get it to the point where I was happy with it. And so I thought, if there's some way I can automate this that doesn't break me out of the flow of creativity, then that's what I should try and do. And so I started developing a working beta for what Curvature would eventually become. Um, and it just allowed me to edit every aspect of a shaper that I could possibly want to edit. And then I thought, actually, maybe this would be a helpful thing for the bassoon community and double reed community at large, only just because creating custom shapers is a very time-consuming and expensive process. And there's no guarantee you're going to be exactly happy with the result when you finally get the version that you've bought, but you already have it and you've paid for it. So if there's a way to experiment with it prior to that and know that you have the right shape, I thought that might be the way forward.
For someone interested in using Curvature, what other items or accessories would they need in order to make the 3D printed shaper function?
So at the very basic level, what you need to make the shaper function is purely a bolt and a nut, just to make sure that the shaper stays together. But to get it to function in the way that I've designed it fully, it helps have a few other elements, and I'll show you as well. It would help to have a spring because, like most commercially available shapers, when you open the top two grips, you get this spring action where it just makes it a lot easier for the shaper to open and you to get the cane out. So there are already embedded indents for an 8 millimeter diameter spring when you print the shaper. Um, on top of that, I think printing some sort of grip for a nut is a very helpful thing as well if you're not using a wing nut, which already is a little bit easier to use. But just printing something online where you can embed a um, whatever nut you're using, it just helps to grab onto the shaper a little bit easier and undo it. And then finally, the thing that I strongly suggest is the metal strip along here, which is steel shim tape. And so this is 30 micron steel shim tape, which is 0.03 of a mil thick. So it's fairly negligible in terms of the thickness that it adds to the overall shaper. But what it does is it allows you to scrape along the shaper without worrying about digging into the filaments. at all. And there are certain filaments that will be a little bit more susceptible to scraping than others, but this essentially prevents that from happening because it'll raise the knife 0.03 millimeters above the cutting surface and essentially will turn it into a metal shaper because the actual pressure of the knife won't really indent into the filament at all as long as you have something protecting the surface. Now, granted, you don't necessarily need this. If you maintain a very shallow angle of scraping, it won't dig into the filament at all. This is just sort of a backup option. Um, Now, things that aren't related to the actual shape or function, but I recommend you have anyway, would be something like a digital caliper, which is just helpful for measuring the actual shaper itself, making sure that your printer is printing the correct dimensions, because some filaments, compared with others, will have a slight amount of shrinkage, but just to maintain the consistency. And the way I recommend using it is if you print a shaper, for every shaper that you generate with Curvature, the buffers on either end are going to be 12 millimeters wide. So you can use that as a test, as a way to make sure that your printer is functioning as it should. And the last thing I recommend is just sort of a very old school radius gauge, which I just have something like this. It's just a collection of little metal pieces that will allow you to accurately measure your reads and also measure the shaper output.
So, looking at the bigger picture, what do you think is going to be, or what could be accomplished with the release of this software?
Well, I think what could be accomplished is that we might find some really interesting shapes that work for various applications that people have just not had maybe the time or, financial ability to experiment with, just because up to this point, it's sort of a very laborious process involving sending away multiple reeds or multiple pieces of, personally shaped cane to a shaper company. They're going to have to measure it, and then generate a shaper based on that measurement. Now, just due to human error, and also just the fact that the cane will change dimensions depending on the humidity of the environment, you're not necessarily going to get exactly an accurate representation of what you're aiming for. So I hope that allowing people to do this from sort of the comfort of their own home will lead to a lot of really interesting experiments and possibly a lot of great developments in the world of bassoon reed making, contrabassoon reed making, heckelphone reed making. Because when you think about every other element of reed making, when you have profilers, gougers, all those things are very adjustable, and easy enough to do a wide array of things with. Whereas shapers, at least for me, I don't know if this is the same for you, Andrew, but I sort of inherited my tendency for using a certain shaper from my teacher in high school, and I sort of stuck with that. And everybody tends to stick with what they're comfortable with. Um, and I think it's just the inaccessibility of adjusting elements of a shaper that prevents people from maybe experimenting a little bit more with it because shapers are so expensive as well. I mean, if you buy a straight shaper, it's roughly the same amount that I paid for my 3D printer. And what you think is that for the cost of a single straight shaper, you can experiment with an infinite number of combinations, not only available shapes, but custom shapes you make yourself. So I hope that we'll get some really interesting results with people experimenting and possibly developing new shapes that could eventually be made into standard shapes that are used worldwide. Ultimately, just creating a wider availability of access for the individual.
Is Curvature a program that every bassoonist should be using?
I think if you're very interested in experimenting with your reed making and seeing truly how far you can stretch things in terms of shaper dimensions and how that affects your sound, I think that's something, it's certainly catered for the individual bassoonist. There's no real technical knowledge that's needed apart from just knowing how your 3D printer works and understanding what dimensions you want from the reed in order to get that. I've tried to make the interface as user-friendly as possible and as fail-safe as possible. For example, you're not going to be able to put in a point that is actually wider than the gouge blade, which would create a flat surface on the shaper. So there are fail-safes in there, so that you will ultimately always get a functioning shaper that you can then modify and experiment with.
The software also includes the shaper measurement calculator, which is a really important tool. And could you just tell us a little bit more about it and why it matters?
The curvature shaper converter will take the value of your flattened reed or your fold over shaper and will convert it into the value you need to plug into the program to get the correct shape in the end. It's a very important thing to be able to get an accurate value because even if you took your flattened reed and applied those values directly into curvature, the actual output shape will not be accurate. It won't even scale correctly because the problem is that using arc length and chord length calculations, which is what this is, those measurements are nonlinear when you convert from one to the other. So even though it might be close, you're essentially going to get an inaccurate shape. So I recommend for anyone wanting to convert from a flat reed measurement or a fold over shaper to plug in your values into the shaper measurement converter, plug in the desired gouge for your straight shaper, and then convert, plug those values in, and then print based on those values.
Just another question on this when we're talking about desired gouge of the shaper. What
Mhm.
are some typical diameters, curvature diameters in straight shapers?
When it comes to gouge diameters for straight shapers, it sort of depends on what country you're buying shapers from. I believe in a lot of the German manufacturers, like I can't speak exclusively, but Reeds and stuff, I think uses 26 for bassoon. Fox, I think uses 32 generally for bassoon. And also contrabassoon. But for me, the important thing in allowing the program to have different gouges and to have those values adjust automatically based on the gouge that you set, it just made it easier to match the way that you're gouging the cane yourself to the actual shaper itself. And I know people have differing opinions on whether it's important to sort of spread the cane out as far as it can go, shape it based on that, or to have it match to the way that you gouge the cane prior to shaping it. I've just given people the option to choose one or the other. So if you select a slightly different gouge, if you had a Fox shaper that you wanted to input, and you've selected 26, it will take the values that you've input, at 32 and will adjust those automatically. Because when you have a smaller gouge, the cane's effectively curving further around the shape. Thus, the overall width of the shape needs to be slightly narrower to compensate for the fact that there's more cane that's getting sort of shoved into a smaller vertical space. So that when it flattens out, you'll get the shape reflecting exactly what the original shape intended.
So, looking ahead, do you have any other goals for curvature?
Looking ahead, there's going to be a lot more shapes that I want to add to the repository. Now, I should add, I tried to make this program as future-proofed as possible. So a lot of the settings, a lot of the shapes, all of that is remotely accessed via a server I have hosted elsewhere. So every time you open up the program, if I've added new shapes or have changed the dimensions of something, it'll automatically update. So there's quite a lot of shapes that I'd like to add moving forward. And also, it's just relying on people trying it and seeing if there's any functions that would be really helpful for them. I've gone back and forth through a lot of different versions and have just found through using the program, there have been things that I've added, like the curvature comb, the showing the point marks along the actual shaper that have ended up being really helpful, I think. Um, Looking forward as well, I'd potentially like to add step file generation, which is step files are used mostly in the CNC machining, and that would allow people to send it directly to a machinist that you could get a metal version if you wanted. The problem being is that step file generation is a completely different pathway to creating an STL file, so it's just restructuring the logic inside the program to make that happen. And then finally, there's an idea I had the other day about adding a scaling function between the different shaper types. So if you had a bassoon shape type that you liked, say Rieger 1A, and you wanted to try it as a contra shape, instead of having to take those measurements and calculate it out yourself, I was thinking of adding a scaling function. So if you have bassoon at 120 and contra bassoon at 150, I think it's a scaling factor of 1.25 or something. Select that, and it'll scale up the selected bassoon shape to the contra shape, which you can then print. Alternatively, you could scale down for bassoon, scale up from other things. I think it would just add more options and ease of accessibility for people trying different shapes, especially shapes that have worked well for bassoon over the years. Whereas there are significantly more bassoon shapes than there are contra shapes. So I thought that having accessibility of those bassoon shapes as contra shapers might be a useful thing without having to upload them as separate presets and just allow people to experiment.
Very interesting. One final question. With the shim tape on your 3D printed shape, the oldest shape that you have, how is it still working fine?
Yes. So actually, the oldest shape I have is one that's not using shim tape at all. It's using a slightly different filament called PETG, which is used in quite a lot of manufacturing parts that holds up quite well to um, friction, especially with knives and all that. That's holding up incredibly well. But the oldest one I've used with shim tape, yeah, it's as good as it was on the first day. The one thing I will say is sometimes if you have shim tape that's self-adhering that doesn't necessarily have a strong backing to it, sometimes the tape can lift up slightly, but it's easy enough just to, push it back down or even put a dab of super glue under it, press it down and keep it going. Yeah, I mean this shaper I've made tons and tons of reads on. All the reads I've been playing on for the last month, and the actual shaper itself, no dimensions have changed. The reads have all been very consistent, and the tape has held up very well. So I think this is definitely the way forward. So if you can get any sort of steel shim tape, you can always, if you can't find something as thin as 30 microns, find a slightly thicker one and then times it by two for each side that it would be on, and then you can subtract that measurement from your shaper values if it's something that's not able to be considered a rounding error. If it's big enough that it would make a difference, just subtract it from the total measurements for each one of the shape points and generate your shapers based on that.
Michael Alderkin, thank you very much for speaking to me today.
Thanks very much, Andrew.
But wait, there's more. Since interviewing Michael last week, he's made ready to release version 2.2 of Curvature, which introduces a number of updates. Some of them even came out of our conversation after we stopped recording that day. Here's an overview of what's new. There will be 77 available presets. More are coming, including empty templates for each instrument type with recommended settings that match the Reeds and Stuff specifications for bassoon. More on that in a second. Historical contrabassoon and contraforte. Intelligent shape lengthening, so if you want to extend a 120mm shape to 140, the program will extrapolate it smoothly. An undo and redo functionality for point editing has been introduced. Collar marks added to better visualize the shape. Unlocked cane length as a text entry field, plus global gouge options. This is step one towards the scaling system Michael and I talked about during the interview. When you engage the offset shape, the distance fields now display parentheses showing the actual offset, so a point at 5mm with a 2mm offset will read as 5 in brackets 2mm, making editing much clearer. Offsets can now go in both directions, so you can apply either a positive or a negative offset. So for those of us who are very interested in redesign, it's an exciting time to be alive. Projects like this show that readmaking is always evolving and that technology can really give us tools to be more independent and creative. I believe this is going to raise the level of bassoon playing, especially for those willing to go the distance and to put in the trial and error needed to discover the shape that best suits their own performance needs. And finally, I spoke with Dominic Schultz at Reeds and Stuff, who told me that they are adjusting their production of straight shapers so that they can produce smaller batches more cost effectively. What this means for us now is that they'll be willing to produce machined versions of custom shapers using your Curvature files for the same price as their standard shapers. Dominic also shared some important specifications. For bassoon and historical bassoon, select a diameter of 26mm in the Curvature program. For contrabassoon, choose 30mm. Standard lengths will be 120mm for bassoon, 140mm for historical bassoon, and 150mm for contrabassoon. Shapes with those parameters will be quick to produce. Shorter lengths are no problem either. They can simply adjust the pin positions, but if you want other diameters, they can still do it, but it might take a little longer. And just like with all Reeds and Stuff products, these shapers will have the hallmarks that you would expect, those silicon tips in the center, engraved lines at the narrowest point of the shape, hard anodizing in their usual colors, and the same engraving style as their other tools. If you'd like to learn more, I've put the links not only to the Curvature website, but also to the places online where you can buy the accessories needed to make a fully functioning shaper tool. And when it comes to 3D printing, if you don't already own a printer, you'll need to look into a solution that works for you. That's it from me today. Thanks very much for watching. If you like these videos and you want to support my activities, please consider becoming a patron via Patreon or by making an order at bassoons.ch. Take it easy. Bye-bye.